so why IP conditionalities? Actually, IP conditionalities are a quite old instrument in industrial policy. They've been applied all over the place in different historical periods. And the idea behind applying conditionalities was that once you kind of enact state-governed industrial policies, you have to make sure that any form of state aid or other forms of support to the private sector are actually implemented so that the objectives are met. And that is the reason why most of the conditionalities that have been applied to that effect were called performance standards. So when we talk about conditionalities, part of the story historically relates to these kinds of performance indicators. But, you know, big scale industrial restructuring processes or even societal restructuring processes also involve profound distributional effects. They create winners and losers. So there is some kind of political imperative to make sure that within the execution of industrial policies, also the social dimensions are paid attention to. And that is, I would argue, the main rationale for considering social conditionalities within industrial policies, so as to promote social acceptance, legitimacy of industrial policy. And that's the reason why in the developmental state literature, social conditionalities have been seen as some sort of an implicit contract, representing an implicit contract between the state, the corporate sector, and society at large, that is based on some kind of a principle of reciprocity that is applied between the public and the corporate sector. Okay, so what kind of forms of conditionalities, typologies, can we differentiate? There is a conventional typology that basically says there are these kinds of performance standards, and these kinds of performance standards, they stipulate certain conditions to be met by a company when implementing a program that is supported by the public sector. So there might be some kind of production quotas, investment quotas, employment quotas, export quotas. There might be some standards that need to be applied. There might be some conditions on implementing training and skills programs. There might be some local content requirements or local sourcing requirements or geographical location guarantees. So that's kind of examples of performance standards. The second type, which I think is quite important also in our current contract, relates to conditions on corporate control. That is, conditions that relate to specific requirements that to some extent constrain or change the corporate governance system of the company that receives public support. And that might, imply domestic ownership conditions, or conditions on promoting intra-sectoral cooperation, inter-firm cooperation, etc., etc. So that's quite important in terms of also, making sure that, for example, affected stakeholders like employees have a say in the implementation and have a say in the monitoring of the implementation and in accountability mechanisms. So that's a second, if you want, type of conditionalities where I think they are particularly important for our current purposes in transformation. And then there is a second typology that was recently suggested by Mariana Mazzucato and Danny Roderick in a recent paper that is a little bit more granular and looks at, differentiates conditionalities according to the type of firm behavior targeted, on the nature of the conditions, whether they are fixed or negotiable or iterative, whether they relate to risks and reward sharing mechanisms, and also, in how far they stipulate certain monitoring and evaluation conditions and procedures. Okay, so when we talk about social conditionalities, what would be typical examples? I use the very crude typology of performance standards versus corporate control conditions. As I already said, performance standards could involve location guarantees. That's something that's used frequently employment quotas, skills upgrading programs, the sharing of new technology, for example, via compulsory licensing requirements or similar arrangements where the public sector, universities or other research institutions gain access to new technology that has been produced by the sponsored program, or very traditional domestic content and sourcing requirements. When it comes to corporate control, all kinds of different conditions are feasible that depend on the context, contextual conditions, the legal situation in the country. So, for example, establishment of works councils or consultation, co-decision rights of works councils in a state-sponsored program at the corporate level, or information and monitoring rights for works councils. Depending on the legal situation, mandatory seats for trade unions and works councils on boards, government boards, corporate boards, sorry. Then particularly labor standards, for example, minimum wage standards. That is a condition that was, for example, used by the United States in recent industrial policy programs, or companies being required to respect collective wage agreements or make or facilitate the conclusion of collective wage agreements, health and safety standards, prohibition of stock buybacks and dividends. That's also, if you want, an intrusion in corporate control, if you do the kind of conditionality, or the sharing of profits, upside profit sharing agreements, also used in the US recently. But there might be other varieties. And as I said, it's basically depending on the specific national or local legal framework. Okay, so what are factors that facilitate or impede the implementation of conditionalities, particularly of social conditionalities? And I would say, okay, on the domestic level, we can differentiate between three different sorts of factors. The first is institutional factors, and that relates to the question of the centralization or decentralization of governance structures. So do we have a very centralized governance structure with a very strong central state or very strong public institutions? Or do we have a very decentralized structure where the balance of power between the public structure and the corporate sector is structured very differently? Typically, in the developmental state literature, there has been a constant argument that if you want to discipline the private sector, you need very strong and centralized state structures. And that has been the case in many experiences of late industrial development in the global south, if you want, in Southeast Asia, and similar experiences. And the second relates to the autonomy of these agencies. Do they profit from a certain distance between themselves and the political system on the one hand, and on the other hand, between themselves and the corporate system? So autonomy is also conducive to promoting conditionalities. The second set of factors relates to coalition building. So if you want to implement some kind of a more comprehensive industrial policy strategy, how do you cope with potential opposition? Not everybody will be happy. There might be ideological motivations behind that, or self-interest or structural conditions that impede industrial policy programs. And here, what is important is the conditioning of framework conditions. So what are, for example, what's the overall strategy? Is the overall strategy to promote certain industries for increasing the export competitiveness of an economy? Or is the overall strategy to kind of substitute imports? That has historically made significant difference in terms of conditioning opposing forces, particularly corporate forces. So not everybody in the, say, corporate sector might be happy with industrial policy, but it depends very much whether, the corporate sector is shielded from international competition or whether it's exposed to international competition. So that is a very important kind of framework condition, how you can influence and incentivize the corporate sector to agree and be cooperative towards industrial policy or not. And the second point is there's an important role for mediating forces, mediating actors. For example, trade unions in the Nordic countries have been very important mediating force for implementing industrial policies, or, for example, banks in post-war Germany, public banks in post-war Germany, have also been very important mediating factors that kind of not only implemented industrial policies, but also conditioned the corporate sector so as to promote and so as to support industrial policy. And the third set of sectors relates to ideational factors, and that relates to, is there some kind of a not only political consensus and agreement in support of industrial policy and also in support of conditionalities, but is there also some kind of a common mindset? Is there a pro-developmentalist mindset shared by all the big, civil society and political forces, or are there very different competing visions of industrial policy? That also plays an important role. So what about the international or system level factors that shape IP conditionalities? Yeah, the first set of issues relates to constraints on policy space due to supranational legal agreements. And I'm not going to talk about that in any detail because we have other more qualified speakers on that. But just let me mention that in the industrial policy literature of the last 25 years, it was very much highlighted that the WTO agreements constrain that policy space because you have certain WTO agreements like the TRIPS agreement that monopolizes knowledge in the form of intellectual property rights, and that is a constraining factor, particularly for countries in the global south that want to implement late industrial development strategies. And there are other WTO agreements, the TRIMS agreement on investment measures, the GATS agreement on services that contain certain disciplining rules with respect to the application of IP conditionalities. When you look at the more recent literature and also at the practical experience of countries implementing industrial policy in the last, say, 10 to 15 years, what you find is, I would say, that the degree of that constraining, of that disciplining space is perhaps not as found as many scholars and people have thought about that. Obviously, there are outright prohibitions, certain outright prohibitions in those agreements, but otherwise, I would argue the recent literature basically makes the point that, well, probably they provide more leeway as previously thought. And the proof of the pudding is in the eating, so to say. You have to try, you have to see what goes, what is accepted, what gets adjudicated by the WTO because another trade party doesn't want it. And what we've seen is that more and more also industrial or advanced industrial countries, and in particular the United States recently, has tried to weaken that framework or has kind of marginalized that framework to some extent. So when you look at the IRA program, the Inflation Reduction Act program, you find local content requirements, which is something that typically is considered to be compatible with WTO law. And I would argue that also when you look at the EU treaties and EU secondary law, some more recent legal work points to the fact that there might be relatively wide margins for member states with respect to implementing social conditionalities. So there's very little in the treaties that outrightly forbids social conditionalities. There might be some exceptions, and that relates particularly to the issue of public equity participation when applying industrial policy programs. But otherwise, I would argue that these system-level constraints might not be as pronounced as perhaps previously thought. The second point, and that's certainly valid for our current discussion, is how can you condition multinational corporations? So we talked about that yesterday already, that there might be certain sectors, semiconductors or digital, certain digital technologies that are basically owned by multinational corporations, and the European Union is in a situation where it feels it needs these kind of technologies, to be produced also domestically in the European Union? How can you, convince those multinational corporations to make investments in the European Union? And in that context, to what extent are they really willing to accept any kind of conditionality? That is the issue of structural power. The argument against, or the argument in favor of the fact that you can convince multinational corporations to accept certain conditionalities is the size of the European market. So I think you have structural power of MNCs on the one side. On the other side, you have the single market with 150 million people and high purchasing power. So those people that say it's still possible to also demand conditionalities from multinational corporations, even in those technologies that I've just mentioned, is that you can condition that upon market access, the European market. That's something that nobody wants to forfeit. The third point here is, and that's also a rather recent phenomenon, and it does have significant effects on industrial policy and also on the question of conditionalities, is geopolitics and geopolitical power, how that plays into industrial policy, the scope and space for industrial policy. And the argument in most of the literature is that geopolitics, geopolitical tensions increase the scope for the implementation of place-based conditionality measures, because countries in certain sectors that are deemed of strategic importance increasingly emphasize the need to produce those strategic goods domestically. So that basically means that all kinds of conditionalities are then implemented so as to make it impossible for those domestic technologies to be exported to other countries considered rivals, etc. Okay, so when you look at how that has played out on the ground in the last couple of years, I think it's quite decisive to look at the United States and what the United States did in terms of implementing industrial policies over the last 5 years. And when you look at the major policy initiatives that were implemented, and there are, I would argue, 4: the American Rescue Plan, the CHIPS and Science Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, what you see is that the volume of those programs has been quite considerable. 500 billion is a wrong figure here, I'm sorry. That was a typo. It's more to the tune of 2.53 trillion US dollars that were implemented with all those programs. There's some kind of a margin here, which is difficult to ascertain because there are different forms of financial support that were implemented, direct financial assistance, tax credits, and other stuff. But when you look at those programs, what you see is that there is quite a large number of social conditionalities that were implemented and that were required from corporations that received these kinds of financial assistance. So you had prevailing wage clauses where wage and benefit rates for projects supported through the federal government were obliged to pay existing market level wages. There was upside sharing agreements where corporate recipients had to share with the US government a portion of any cash flows or returns that exceeded the applicant projections about profits above a certain threshold. There were domestic content and sourcing requirements. There was, for example, a prohibition of stock buybacks or dividend payouts in the CHIPS Act, or alternatively, excise taxes on stock buybacks in other programs. There were requirements for regular financial and programmatic reports to agencies, particularly the CHIPS program office that was introduced with the CHIPS Act. There was a prohibition of expanding manufacturing in foreign countries of concern, particularly China, for 10 years. A prohibition of joint research and technology licensing agreements involving sensitive technologies, and other disciplinary mechanisms, particularly in the CHIPS Act. So what we see here is, I would argue, comparatively at least, a rather high level of social and other conditionalities that were required from US companies receiving those financial assistances. So what are the factors that explain that in the American context? Firstly, I would argue there was a rather comprehensive effort towards domestic coalition building, not only across the political system, but also involving other actors, particularly the American trade unions, played a very proactive role in specifically pushing for the IRA program. So there was a big political campaign that extended towards lobbying all kinds of, political representatives. And that was supported then also across the political spectrum. And the second critical factor, I would argue, had to do with a certain discursive development in the United States that is not paralleled in Europe. And that's for good or for worse. I'm not making an ethical judgment here. I'm just saying the interesting thing is that over the last 10 years in the United States, there was a near consensus building among all dominant political and even civil society forces, including the trade unions, that there is this kind of competition and rivalry between the US and China. And China is the big, kind of power and big power rival that needs to be contained. And with that mindset, it was able and it was possible for good or for worse to promote all these kinds of policies. So the motivation is primarily geopolitical. To some extent, it has to do also with domestic factors, given that the internal political system in the United States shifted over the last 30 years towards this kind of populist discourse that we've seen with the emergence of Trump. And that has very much to do with not compensating the losers of structural change in the United States over the last 30 years, and the very pronounced regional effects that this produced in the Middle East, in the former industrial regions in the Midwest of the United States. So there are also very important domestic factors, but the other point is there was this change in the geopolitical sector. So when you look at the European Union in comparison, what you see is that we've had a number of industrial policy programs. For example, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, with also a sizable volume, objectives to promote economic resilience, strategic autonomy, and the green and digital transitions, but very weak conditionalities. So there were some procedural conditions for member states, detailed national plans, and some, formal, very kind of constrained formal conditionalities on private companies receiving state aids, particularly, for example, to issues related to the prevention of fraud, but not social conditionalities or other forms of performance standards. And even the European Court of Auditors recently noted that there is kind of a lack of common indicators weakening the capacity of the Commission to monitor the execution of the plan. So even in procedural terms, conditions were rather weak. Very similar story when you look at the EU CHIPS Act. Again, basically just ex ante approval and monitoring conditionalities implemented by the European Commission, but basically no ex post conditionalities. One notable exception, there was a clawback profit sharing mechanism under one IPSE program, the IPSE program on microelectronics and communication technologies. So companies were required to redistribute extra profits obtained as a result of EU funding. And when you look at the difference between the European CHIPS Act and the US CHIPS Act in terms of social conditionalities, what you see is obviously that the geopolitical motivation in the European Union was much weaker. It was, there were kind of different views on particularly the EU position versus China, with, for example, the German government supported by German industries being very cautious on China. That was one factor, I think, that motivated this rather weak form of conditionalities. And the security of supply and competitive motivations, again, the background of the European CHIPS Act, I would argue, and in the American case. Okay, the third case study relates to the European Defense Fund that has already been mentioned. What you see here is a rather small volume of 8 billion grants, prizes, and procurements to private companies for the co-financing of military research and development projects. Here you have a very strong geopolitical motivation that has, undergirded this kind of initiative. And you have rather encompassing performance standards, in particular regulations that restrict the access of EDF funding to companies established in at least 2 member states, associate members that are part of the European economic areas, and third country entities can only participate in very exceptional circumstances. And secondly, conditions related to use of intellectual property rights resulting from funded projects must not be controlled by third country or third country entities. So these are basically geopolitical conditions. They're not social conditions. But nevertheless, in these kind of defense programs, what you see is somewhat stronger form of conditionalities. But again, social conditionalities are largely absent. So how do you then explain the relatively weak EU IP conditionalities? I would argue that, again, there are certain ideational factors that come into play here. Geopolitical mindset is relatively weaker. There is a continued commitment to the liberal rules-based international order. That is something that is, very strong also in official rhetoric of the European Commission and others. And that basically means that these rules, it has to be accepted that these rules constrain the policy space that we have. And there's a stronger commitment to other liberal economic dogmas, in particular fiscal austerity, which basically means that, also the older liberal thinking behind that says, well, you should not do that kind of selective industrial policies except for very specific exceptions. You should stay to horizontal policies, etc., etc. So that plays a role here. I would say in terms of institutional factors, what we see is European industrial policy is still rather decentralized. European Commission, the powers of the European Commission are basically to coordinate, and with the exception of the RRF, the financing power of the Commission is still severely constrained. That basically means member states remain primary competence, and there are very heterogeneous dynamics at the member state level. And lastly, coalitional factors. I would argue that the coalition underpinning the green transformation has turned out not to be very stable. We have political support weakened as a consequence of the pandemic and the cost of living crisis. And if you want, the emergence of right-wing populist parties that are very openly against the kind of European Green Deal that has been implemented over the last couple of years. Partial exception is perhaps defense policy. And the corporate sector, I would argue, in the European Union is in principle in favor of IP assistance, but much more against the background of organizing wealth transfers from the state to the corporate sector, not so much in terms of a proactive commitment to structural change and innovation. And the role of trade unions and civil society as full stakeholders has been also constrained by the institutional arrangements in place. So what we've seen is that the Commission discusses much more with the corporate sector when it speaks about those programs and designs those programs than with other stakeholders. Okay, what to do? My first point is, if we accept that social conditionalities are primarily shaped by political factors and not so much by legal constraints, I think that then calls into question, or that brings to, that basically means that we also have to look at how can we shape the framework conditions, the political and economic framework conditions, in a way that incentivizes opposing forces, resisting forces, to give to agree to some form of more comprehensive industrial policy, including on social conditionalities. And I would argue that that basically means to be rather careful, from a progressive point of view, in terms of subscribing to this kind of geopolitical narrative. Instead, we should try to design and construct an alternative IP narrative that is more based on something like a new European social contract, a social compact, based on reciprocity and shared objectives. So as to bring in other civil society and actors, and perhaps also trade unions, to support industrial policy more practically. My impression is that across civil society, industrial policy is still, looked at as a very ambivalent policy tool. when you talk to many on green movement, many other segments of civil society, rather hesitant, rather skeptical attitude, I would argue. So I think if you want to change that and broaden the coalition for industrial policy, you need this kind of social contract-based narrative. The second point is giving corporate resistance to worker-oriented industrial policy. I think the political economic framework should be modeled to incentivize corporate cooperation, for example, by combining state aid and public support with a rather open European market. That's something that might be controversial in the discussion here. So I'm a bit cautious in terms of following suit on the American approach of increasing tariff rates for Chinese imports or whatever, so as to erect tariff barriers, because that would basically mean that the European corporate sector is shielded from international competition, and I'm not sure whether that would really incentivize the European corporate sector to follow suit on industrial policy that is really innovation and structural change based. The incentive might be, okay, we are the only players in town. The European economy depends on us. No Chinese competition, or very little Chinese competition, or other competition otherwise. It might disincentivize innovation. So I would argue that we have to combine more proactive state aid with a rather open European economy. That's number one. And number two is, I would argue that we shouldn't pay so much attention to kind of, get rid of all state aid rules so as to make it possible for member states to support and increase industrial policy measures. We should push for increasing EU-level funding instruments. I think that's very important, also in terms of not allowing the single market with its very internal and differentiated dynamics to further disintegrate. The third point is, I think we need to forge these broader alliances between labor, civil society, public sector companies, perhaps also small and medium enterprises and cooperatives in the third sector in support of transformation. Fourthly, I think that it is important to focus on promoting the development of industrial ecosystems with a multitude of diverse actors, instead of making a strong emphasis on giving money to multinational corporations. There might be exceptions in certain technological areas. Otherwise, I'd be very much in favor, not only from economic reasons, but also for political reasons, focus on the build-up of these industrial ecosystems that are basically based on social and economic actors with a stronger view on the internal market. And lastly, I would argue that any kind of industrial policy that we're doing should not be exclusionary, particularly versus operations with companies and partners from third countries, including from China. So given our large dependencies on green technologies, example from China, I think the way forward should be incentivize cooperations between European companies and Chinese companies on green tech, for example. So we should not rule out these kinds of cooperation. And I think we have a very different infrastructure here than the United States. The last point, I'm not going to elaborate on that. That's just an add-on, and Dragana Damjanovic will also speak on that, is I think the industrial policy mix of instruments should not only rely on state aid per se, it should also emphasize more public equity participation via investment funds, for example, or via public development banks. So I think equity participation in the form of patient capital is also very important in terms of promoting the kind of industrial policy from a progressive perspective that we are looking for. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.